All right, guys, what's up? So today in this video, we are talking to Lewis. Lewis is a YouTuber who has been to some very fascinating places, some places that I have really wanted to go to in a lot of my travels when I was in Brazil not too that long ago. So when I came across his channel, I thought it was really fascinating. Some of the places that he had been to, some really old colonial places in Brazil, places with a lot of history. So, without further ado, Lewis, welcome. Thank you for for joining me today.
Hey, yeah, I'm Lewis, and I have a little YouTube channel about the same size as yours.
Yeah.
And I the majority of my videos were in Brazil at this time, and I also made some in Argentina and Chile. But as of now, most of the content that I made is mainly stuff like I would go to colonies. That's what the locals basically call them. In, for example, the south of Brazil, there are these cities that were founded by Germans, and some that were founded by Austrians, some that were founded by Pomeranians, like way in the 1800s. And there's also Italian cities. There's a few Ukrainian cities, and also in the south of Chile, there are a lot of Germans, and in parts of Argentina, there's a lot of Germans. I didn't find as many, didn't feel much about that, but that's basically what I mainly do. And
Yeah, no, I thought it was, it's really cool the places that you went to in Brazil, like watching your videos, you're walking around and you're literally speaking to people in I mean, it seems like
in
German and
German,
Dutch,
I
even
don't speak
some of
Italian.
them.
Yeah, I there are a few Dutch colonies in Brazil, and compared to the German colonies, they were like the number of settlers was a lot smaller, and it's got kind of like you have a few families, and they tended to be farmers, and they grew these really big farms. Often they have like a sort of kind of yeah, like corporation of sorts, like I don't know what to call it.
Yeah,
They
yeah.
they have this organization where all these farmers work together,
A co-op?
a cooperative. Often they had like a cooperative in this like city that they founded, and you have these big like these Dutch families that own these big farms in one city called Holambra, which is really famous for flowers, and it has a lot of tourism because of the big flower industry there. It's like the biggest flower producer in all of Latin America. But it was founded by Dutch people. And flowers are also mainly like tulips are a really big industry in the Netherlands.
Yeah.
And these farmers, I talked to some of them, and they pass on their language like a few generations, but it really degrades because they don't really speak outside of their family, and then they learn Portuguese in school, and then it kind of gets watered down. I talked to an older guy that said his one of his kids was studying in the Netherlands. Now his children spoke some Dutch, and his grandchildren it depended because one of his grandchildren I think studied in the Netherlands, and another one didn't speak Dutch that well. It kind of depended. But in the German towns and cities, there are quite a lot that still speak German day to day, like especially the smaller ones, or when it's like held up, the traditions are kind of held up by tourism. That's also kind of a factor sometimes.
Yeah. So, I mean, I gotta ask you before getting into because I find that the whole like history of colonialism and all that stuff really fascinating when you walk around Latin America because it's one of the
Yeah,
places you
because
see it. You could see it in the
yeah,
people in everything that they do. But one thing I really wanted to ask you is what made you so interested in going to these places? Because obviously you're in Brazil. There's a million things you could be doing. You could be partying in Rio with big booty Brazilian chicks or something.
yeah, yeah.
But you're going to these, these really obscure and very kind of unique places with a lot of history. What made you so fascinated with that stuff?
Well, personally, these unique places were actually what made me want to go to Brazil. And I was able to find like the most places to make content about from like Japanese, Italian, German, Austrians, also kind of German, Ukrainian, Polish, Dutch, all in quite a small region of Brazil close together. And that's why I was able to make a lot of content there. I also visited some things in Chile and Argentina that kind of fit like the same topic. But I came up with this idea during the COVID pandemic. I was kind of like stuck at home, not being able to go anywhere. Almost all countries are closed. At the time, I really wanted to go to Japan, and I still do. I haven't been there yet. But then I saw a few videos, really kind of like a slideshow style videos, like animated, like stick figure art, that kind of stuff, country ball, about the Japanese population in Brazil, because Brazil has the second largest Japanese population outside of Japan. They have the biggest Japanese population outside of Japan, so second biggest Japanese population. And that's not really a country that you would expect to be the country with the most Japanese,
Yeah, no.
but it has to do with a history of in Brazil they were looking for settlers, and they mainly wanted Europeans because they wanted to widen the country. But for example, Italy, they received a lot of Italians, but then Italy banned immigrating to Brazil because they were treating them really badly. And a few other countries did similar things.
Yeah.
And at that time, also the United States had, I don't remember what they're called, but there were laws in the United States that banned immigration to Chinese, later Japanese. And this was all before the Second World War.
Yeah.
And then there was the Meiji Restoration in Japan. It was really modernizing, but there were also a lot of problems with overpopulation, not having enough food at the time. And because of that, both the Japanese government was trying to get Japanese people to emigrate to other countries. A lot of them went to Peru first, but the land wasn't as fertile there. And though, of course, still they're still farming in Peru, but they just weren't as accustomed to it. There were several reasons why that didn't work out as well, and there are still Japanese in Peru, but a lot of them left for Brazil or went back. And when the numbers that went to Peru went down, a lot of immigration to Brazil started. And also sometimes the Japanese didn't really know where they were going to end up. They might have thought that they were going to the United States and then ended up in Brazil, not being able to pay a ticket back because that was very expensive.
Yeah.
But I found basically the main thing that I found really interesting is hearing about this fact. I started searching for like temples or like cultural buildings, like anything in Brazil, because I heard this, but they weren't showing anything. They were showing some old Wikipedia pictures, and that was about it. And then I didn't speak Portuguese at the time, but just by like using Google Translate and translating these keywords to Portuguese, I would like search for Japanese temples and stuff like that. And I ended up finding different cities with Japanese temples and other monuments. There was, for example, like a kind of like a Japanese castle, which was like a monument that was built in, I think, 2006 or something like that. I ended up visiting there. That video isn't ready yet, but I ended up visiting there, meeting some people, and I was talking to this guy that was obviously of the Japanese descent, and he told me like, "Hey, my aunt actually helped design this building. Like she's an architect. She worked on this building, and
Yeah.
then he called his aunt. I met his aunt. They invited me over for, I think it was lunch. And you had like this whole like Japanese Brazilian family. And I lived in this gated community. And we were having like sushi and yakisoba and eating with chopsticks in Brazil. And that was something I really wanted to experience. And I had the idea to combine it with making content because, of course, the immense financial expense to make such a big trip and then go to all these really unknown, far away places that people don't know about, that normal tourists don't go, then I might as well film it and share it to the world because otherwise it's not as much worth it.
Yeah, yeah, no, and it looks like it's I mean, a lot of those videos have done pretty well. Like you and the Austrian colony did over like a quarter of million views, and So you obviously you know a lot about history and everything like that when you're going to some of these places. I'm curious, like, what is running through your mind when you're walking in some of these places? Maybe you're even like speaking an old colonial language with some of these people. What is sort of like what is sort of like going on through your mind as you're sort of walking through really like the remnants of like a past culture? Just like it's
Yeah, because
kind
the
of there,
strange
but it
thing is
yeah.
we call them colonies, and the local people do as well. But they're kind of like settlements in established countries, like what I'm talking about right now. Because the like nation state colonies of back in the day, those are a lot more well known. But in pretty much all of the Americas, in the United States, you have this as well. Even in the United States, there are regions that had like German communities where everyone used to speak German back in the day. And it was only during World War II that they cracked down on this practice. And I think they made it illegal, or they made it a lot more difficult to practice your native language. And you have this in, I would say, probably mainly because often they weren't the dominant population and they lived in like isolated regions. In Latin America, they retained a lot more of their culture than they did in the United States. Because in both parts of the continent, or both continents, their culture has been cracked down upon at certain periods. But what I kind of think of making these videos, well, when I started out, I did a trip through Europe, visiting some places, and I kind of saw this as like an way to like kind of practice being on talking to the camera. Um, and because YouTube is a lot more of like an informal type of content, I don't want it to be like a very official documentary style. I want it to be like a little bit more personal and accessible. But I do try to put in as many things to represent the culture as possible. So I kind of think to myself, and I've done this from the start, if I can speak the language, I'll try to find people in this region that you wouldn't expect to be of this culture. For example, Germans in Brazil. I'll try to find German speakers and speak German to them. Right now, I'm working on a video of the Italian culture in the south of Brazil.
Wow.
And I asked a lot of people there, do you speak Italian? Personally, I speak Portuguese. I don't speak Italian. I know a few words, but a lot of people told me, like, yeah, I speak Italian. And I think the majority of the people that I asked did speak some Italian, or at least, and I think all of them at least understood some of it because the languages are relatively similar. Um, so I try to find people that speak the language, and if I do speak the language, speak it with them. I try to find old buildings representing like the history, because, for example, regarding the Japanese history of Brazil, I went into the countryside, like into the Brazilian jungle, to visit old Japanese buildings, old Japanese houses that were built by Japanese immigrants with like the wooden joinery and like bamboo walls, and they were basically kind of ruins. They were all kind of falling apart and rotting away. But one benefit of that was in the walls you could sometimes see a part that was partly broken up, and you could see the exposed bamboo and straw that the wall was made up of, like old traditional Japanese methods. And I also tried to show like the more modern monuments to like remember the culture, eat the food a little bit, and anything else I can think of that is interesting, or anything that I happen to experience that I didn't anticipate. I tend to like plan out a few places that I try to visit. And sometimes I meet people and I ask them, hey, I'm interested in your culture, the colonialist history here. I talk to Japanese Brazilians. I talk to Welsh people in Argentina, Afrikaners, people of Boer descent in the south of Argentina, and I talk to some Germans in the south of Chile. And often they tell me like stuff that I didn't even know existed because it wasn't there is no information on it on the internet. and sometimes you get really like interesting experiences just because of that.
Yeah, I think it's in one of those places because I would also see it a little bit walking around in places in southern Brazil where they have like some German ancestry and stuff like that, there as well, and a bunch of different other places. And every now and then, you would come across someone that was maybe you could like just look at them and very clearly tell that they're okay. This is very clearly basically just a European, someone that it has
Yeah,
like phenotype, blonde hair, blue eyes, even, and then you have kind of the rest of Brazil, and it very much feels like those places that you go to where you still are able to see that. It very much is like it's like a relic, like it's interesting, it's cool, but
yes, they are.
it definitely seems like something that it seems like
But
the best.
also something that I really noticed is a lot of them are kind of like tourist spots, and sometimes even kind of
Yeah,
like a Disney World to Brazilians.
yeah, yeah,
Because some of these towns are really some of them exist mainly because of the tourism, and some of them are a lot more artificial than others. I tried to mainly visit the ones that had more like real authentic history. But you also told me before that you went to, for example, Blumenau, which is a
no,
relatively big city in the region,
yeah,
and they have a lot of these like plastic, quite new buildings
yeah,
that they try to make in a German style, but it's not authentic. It's not an authentic old German building. They like make it with modern methods,
yeah.
and then they kind of like paint the wooden timber on top, stuff like that.
Yeah, so what do you think contributed what are some of the things you think contributed to that kind of that disintegration? Because obviously at one point in time, I imagine just like I could imagine, especially some of those places, they're very exotic. Like Blumenau is like a relatively exotic scenery and environment to be having like a German town sort of in the middle of it. It's not something you'd necessarily
True, true. It's
come
like the
across.
most temperature you get in Brazil,
Yeah.
but it's still
So
Brazil.
it's like, what do you think? Because at one point they were probably a very closed culture. They probably didn't want to integrate too much with the Brazilians. They probably wanted to keep their own language and and they probably didn't want to like, intermarry with any of the locals for a while.
And
But obviously,
some
eventually,
still don't.
those cultural sort of boundaries have kind of disintegrated. What do you think maybe contributed to some of that kind of that cultural disintegration?
Well, there are a number of things. One really big one is during their, I think in Brazil they've had dictatorships and military rule. And during the Second World War, it wasn't legal to speak German. It wasn't legal to speak Japanese. It wasn't legal to speak Italian because these were the opposing side in the Second World War. And Brazil joined the United States because that was the side that seemed to be on the winning side. And perhaps they had, it's debatable rather they have more similar cultural values because during this time, the view on like race and stuff like that was so quite different, even in nations that were quite diverse. The ruling class you tended to be a lot more European, even though there were often like a few exceptions or some slightly mixed people. But it's still noticeably the case that even today in Latin America. So I think these languages and in connection to the language, also the culture being cracked down upon was the biggest thing. But then there's also, of course, they were very small, isolated communities in the south when highways were being built. It became a lot easier to travel such vast distances by car. Cars existed longer than the like huge infrastructure of like paved asphalt and like good highways and major roads. What you can really see in Brazil, I don't know if you noticed this as much as I did, because I went to a lot of like far off places. A lot of parts of Brazil still have like dirt roads, towns with dirt roads. Like there's not a single paved road in the town. Sometimes it's like a little town, or it's just like gravel, or they have like cobblestone streets. Some cities in the south of Brazil have like laws that the areas that are considered historically significant, they have to have cobblestone streets, and they're not allowed to have asphalt. So then you notice that sometimes if you're in these regions, which is kind of interesting. But yeah, regarding other parts of the world, like the United States and Europe, a big contributor to like the immigration from other parts of the world was like the intention of not just the airplane, but the Boeing 77s that became affordable enough for massive amounts of people to travel to the other side of the planet, but also in a quite an affordable and quick way. Because back in the day, they used to go by ship, but to go to these small communities, you didn't just turn up by ship. You had to turn up at like the Port of Santos, which is close to Sao Paulo, which is the biggest city in Latin America. And then they would have to travel either through rivers by boat and then by car or all kinds of different modes of transport to actually get to the place that they settle.
Yeah.
And now, with how easy transportation is, it's one country, and it's not as if they like restrict entry to people that are not of that culture.
Yeah.
And because of that, this, of course, to like trade with the entire continent, you have to speak either Portuguese or Spanish. So anyone that wanted to study had to learn Portuguese in Brazil or Spanish in those other nations. One thing that you do see, which is a little bit different in Chile and in Brazil, you have some of this as well, but I really noticed this in Chile. In Chile, you have a lot of German schools, and their German schools are kind of like private schools, and they will give, I think they give some of their classes in German. I'm not sure if they're all in German, but they're very expensive for the average Chilean. But upper class Chileans will often send their children to German schools. And then these German communities themselves, they also send their children to these German schools. And that doesn't mean that everyone is completely of European descent. A lot of the people in Chile are mixed, and the upper class tends to be a little bit less, tends to be percentually like a higher percentage European, but a lot of the people are still mixed. But these German schools still have kind of like a higher status in a sense, and they offer good education. They tend to be private schools, and yeah, and I think it's quite an interesting thing because in Brazil, the all the big schools were just they taught in Portuguese,
Yeah.
and only now recently, in like the last decade or so, schools started to open up or started to offer German classes in these German towns, Japanese classes in these Japanese towns, because now only now recently they're trying to preserve these cultures, and for a long time they haven't. And
Yeah.
it's kind of, I think the gist of it is if your government doesn't support you maintaining your culture,
Yeah.
and there's no way to enforce it, and you're a small minority, then it's hard to hold on to it. You
Yeah.
get what I mean?
Yeah, no, absolutely, and that's interesting what you say about, kind of the German schools, for example, in Chile. I thought it's so interesting how noticeable the difference is when you notice kind of the class divide in places where it's very visual. For example, like when I went to, I don't know if you went to like Curitiba, but it's a big city in southern Brazil.
Yeah,
But I noticed it was so stark the difference between when I'm walking around kind of in the lower class, like center of town.
yeah,
Visually the people, and then you go to this other part or this other neighborhood in the town where there's this, for example, they have this kind of luxury mall in Curitiba, Brazil, and they have like Louis Vuitton and Gucci, and they have like
yeah, yeah,
they have
of
like
course.
Porsches in in the mall, or like Aston Martins and stuff like that. And just visually, like the people are clearly different.
It also
Same,
it
you
also really shows
yeah.
that a lot of people still talk about the concept of first world nations and third world nations, and then they often forget about second world nations, which used to be the communist countries. But these are like old dated Cold War terms.
Mhm.
And a lot of people still have this perception of East Asia, like mainly Southeast Asia, of course, not Korea and Japan, but Southeast Asia and Latin America as being these like third world nations, and then them living in these first world nations. But really today, this is quite a bit different. Like Latin America as a whole has like half the population of India, but three times the GDP. And there's a lot of differences in like wealth regionally, but also like class differences in the same region. And in some places you will notice this more than other places. But in Latin America, there are, I think actually in Brazil, there's like a lot of the world's billionaires are actually from Brazil. It's not as if there's no rich people in these countries that we might consider as poor countries.
Yeah.
But basically, their underclass has a lot lower wage. They still have like a minimum wage, but it's like $400 or like $400 or $500 instead of closer to like 2000. And because of that, food will be cheaper. A lot of that kind of stuff will be cheaper. Building a house will be cheaper. But other things like electronics are really maybe really expensive because of like import tax and government kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's interesting to see like how different this part of the world is from like our perception.
Well, I'm curious how you maybe kind of like attribute some of these things almost, you could even say maybe on like a bit of like a moral level, because a lot of people will look at these things, they'll look at these kind of these remnants of colonialism. And you could see, for instance, like, yeah, okay, there's a very clear like class distinction between people that are probably more of European descent and then people that are of more indigenous descent. There's a very clear difference. And especially in America, on kind of like in a very political context, you have people will naturally the reaction is to insinuate, okay, this is a bad thing, this is an evil thing. Anything that has to remotely touch this kind of space, especially when you're talking about colonialism, a lot of times in the West is sort of something that's condemned as as an unadulterated evil, as something that was 100% bad. So I'm curious how attribute colonialism. Like, what do you think of it in?
I would say it's a lot more complicated than that, and I think most things are a lot more complicated than like the mainstream conversation. But one thing you do see in Latin America as a whole is most of the people in wealth will also be mixed because most people in Latin America are of mixed race. And there's this concept of being Latino or Latina, and this is mainly like a cultural grouping because, like we've talked about before, in these countries you have people that are Austro-European descent, you have mixed people, you have indigenous people, African descended people, and everything in between. But I specifically visited a lot of these colonies that were settled by people of a specific culture that tried to kind of hold on to their culture and went with people from the same country to settle one city, for example, or settle a region. And that really makes that the people that are more wealthy will maybe be more of a certain a certain ethnic background. But if you go to other parts of Brazil, like Sao Paulo, the biggest city, you notice something that's much more normal for the continent. Most people with wealth, they will also be mixed, but they tend to be a little bit more on the European side of things,
Yeah.
but they will still be mixed because Brazil has had so many generations of having a diverse country. And colonization also started earlier than it did in the United States. And with such a far history, you might have a real like full-blooded African ancestor, like I don't know what's realistic, like maybe 8 generations back. Wow. And that's also the main reason that these days a lot of people just say Latino to refer to this group of people, because a lot of them are mixed race, and it's hard to categorize mixed race people and like attribute certain things to them because someone that's half like small percentage black and Japanese
Yeah.
and someone that's like 100 100 different things.
Yeah, yeah. I think
How how how
there's like,
how do you want to like group make comparisons between different groups if
yeah,
it's if
I
it's
think
a mix?
I saw a
It's more
chart
difficult to do.
once. I think I saw a chart once of like, because the Spaniards, like when they were sort of administering all of this, they were trying to classify people in all these
Yeah,
different ways. And it
yeah,
started off as just like something like just like mestizo, which is like European mixed, and then it was like castizo, which is like
yeah.
two-thirds European, and then there was like zombos, there were like there were coyotes, like there was like it ended up breaking down into there being, dozens and dozens of different like racial categories where eventually they just,
But
gave up on it.
I must say a lot of the colonies settlements that I visited were founded later than this period. A
Yeah.
lot of them were founded because the south of Brazil was not very highly populated. And though it was a part of Brazil, Brazil was afraid that either Paraguay, which was a lot stronger back then than it is now, and Argentina might try to take this southern portion of the country. They also lost Uruguay, which at some point was a part of Brazil. And their most southern state, Rio Grande do Sul, also has been independent for like, I don't know, and maybe it wasn't even a year. But for a very short time, their most southern state was independent.
Yeah.
And to try and like make their grip on this piece of land stronger, they tried to get more settlers there. And there was a lot of good farmland, or at least opportunity to build farmland. And they wanted to Europeanize the country. That's kind of the mindset that the government had at that time. And that's why they asked a lot of Europeans to go there. But that other parts in the country's history, this wasn't necessarily the case.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. What do you think was leading those people? So around these, most of these places that you were going to, were they roughly colonized around the same time? And what do you think
It
was?
depends a little bit. There are some different time periods. Comments that I get a lot on my videos. I get a lot of comments from Brazilians on my videos, and it's either them talking about how grateful they are that I'm showing the south of Brazil to like for an audience, and the other half says that they're all Nazis and racist, and that they want nothing to do with them. And that's the reality, because there's of course the idea that a lot of the Germans in Latin America are came there after the Second World War. But in reality, this isn't quite the full truth. For example, in the south of Brazil, there are a lot of people descended of Pomeranians. And this was before even the First World War. In the 1800s, a lot of Pomeranians went over to Brazil, and their nation now doesn't exist anymore. Most of it is Poland today.
Yeah.
A lot of the Italians, I think a lot of them went a little later. I went to this Austrian colony, which was my most watched video. That one was founded in, I think, 1933, which was before the Second World War. And it was some kind of collaboration between the, I think the wife of the Emperor of Brazil was a Habsburg. She was from Austria, and they made some kind of arrangement that this like settlement, this colony came out of, and that's how the colony was founded. And that doesn't mean that like a lot of people that fled, Germans that fled to Latin America, settled in these colonies, and they went to Latin America and they went to these places because they already existed. And I think in Argentina, the settlements like in Bariloche and also Cordoba, which you visited,
Yeah.
a lot of the Germans there, a higher percentage of them are former, not necessarily not necessarily National Socialists. A lot of the people that fled were also just normal people that served in the army because there was conscription and everyone had to. But some of them were also party members and so on.
Yeah.
But in Brazil, a lot of them were from immigrated there from much earlier. And they tend to be a little bit more conservative. They tend to vote Bolsonaro instead of Lula. I vote more right wing instead of left wing.
You made a good point that like a lot of people have the conception, especially in Argentina, that most of the German population or a lot of the German population came after World War II, which is true. But I also thought it was fascinating. I went to some of these small German villages around like the Entre Rios province in Argentina, and they were actually descended from Germans that came from the Volga River. Like they were before they came to
Yeah, that's
America.
but it's a
They were
very
living
different
on the
example.
Volga River in
Yeah,
Russia. So it was fascinating. It's like you find these, I forget which part of Germany they originally were from, but it's like they were invited in by Catherine the Great to come and like kind of
yes,
settle along the Volga. And then I forget at what point roughly Russia was obviously going through some issues. So they decided to, leave and then end up in Latin America. And at first, a lot of them
yeah,
started off in Brazil, but then they didn't like the climate so much. So they started moving even further and further south.
There's
And
still some in
so
Brazil,
and so
actually.
it's like yeah, and so it's like you see some of these people that, they look German, like, I went to some of these towns and the signs a lot of the signs are still in German names,
Yeah, or
and
sometimes both.
yeah, and sometimes both, and it would so it's like and you see these and it's like there's a direct kind of, like, line and lineage that goes all the way back centuries of these one particular people group that had, navigated across, various continents to end up getting to, that place where they were. It was
Yeah.
quite fascinating.
Well, also, a lot of these people, like, that's a good example that you're giving here, because during the time of the German Empire, Eastern Europe was kind of like the Wild West was the frontier of the United States. And there were a lot of settlements. For example, these Volga Germans in the Volga region in what is now Russia, was also the Russian Empire back then. They settled in all these different regions. There were a lot of big cities. A lot of the big cities in Eastern Europe were founded by Germans. A lot of them also had sizable Jewish populations. So that's how Yiddish came about. It's kind of a mix of German. It's kind of like a cryptic German of sorts.
Yeah.
And when these people were expelled from their lands for various reasons, for example, the Soviet Union kicked them out of the Soviet Union. Sometimes they put them to like they sent them to the Far East. Some Volga Germans still live in Russia, but they live all the way out in Siberia in the middle of nowhere. A lot of these populations, for example, these Germans that lived in the far east of Europe, out in not Siberia, they didn't settle that far, but they settled like Russia, Ukraine, parts of Poland. That was also a complicated situation surrounding like the First and the Second World War with like ethnic tensions and redrawing of maps and stuff. It has to do with this kind of stuff. And when a lot of these people were expelled, they, a lot of them moved to what is now Germany, but also a lot of them moved to the New World. And a lot of them moved to the United States. But in the United States, they assimilated a lot more because of similarity in culture. Of course, they are both Germanic cultures. It was
Yeah.
easier to assimilate over to becoming English speaking, and the culture isn't as different as it is compared to a Latin culture like the Portuguese-based Brazilian culture. And a lot of some of the Pomeranians that moved to the south of Brazil moved moved there much earlier, but others moved there. Also, some Germans moved there after World War II because they were expelled from what is now Poland today. A lot of land that used to be German is now part of Poland or part of Russia. There's this small exclave of Russia called Kaliningrad, I
Yeah.
think. Well, I still call it Königsberg, but
Yeah.
it's a little remnant of German history. It used to be like a kind of the center of Prussia, but that doesn't really exist anymore. But in a way, it still does in Latin America. And
Mhm.
that's, I find that very interesting. And that's why I wanted to visit there and make these kinds of videos, because a lot of the topics that I made videos about, no one had quite made a video on that topic in the way that I did.
Yeah.
One thing that is kind of famous in Brazil is the Liberdade in Sao Paulo. It's a neighborhood that's considered a Japanese neighborhood. Even this neighborhood has a lot older history. Used to be like a big cemetery, people told me, and they like basically flattened the entire cemetery and built like buildings there, houses, and so on. But now it's considered the Japanese neighborhood. But it's not. It doesn't have as much history, and not quite in the same way as to me these cities do. These
Yeah.
little cities that try to hold on to their culture. I found that a lot more interesting than like a little Chinatown. In Brazil, this will be a Japantown, but
Yeah. Yeah.
it's not the same thing, because in maybe if you're from the United States, there will be a Chinatown in major cities in the United States,
Yeah.
but not a Chinese city or a Japanese city or a German city.
Yeah, yeah. No, that is really fascinating. I think what's also so fascinating about like learning about this region is a lot of kind of an interesting point that you brought up is back then for these people to travel, there's obviously so much, friction in them traveling. There weren't
Yeah, it
plenty.
was basically if you moved there, you're never going back home.
Yeah, so it's like these people were coming on boats. I remember there was a story that an Argentinian girl told me one time about her family coming to Latin America, and they were originally supposed to get off in Brazil. Like there was a certain amount of like stops that the boat took, and she said,
Um,
"All right, you have to wait 3 stops and then you get off." Like that's what her family members were, telling her
and then
ancestors.
they don't speak Spanish,
And
of course, and they don't speak
yeah, and they
Portuguese.
didn't speak Spanish,
Yeah,
Portuguese, but they just like when the boat arrived at I think of Rio de Janeiro, they just missed the stop, and so then they ended up in Argentina. They got off in Argentina, and they had no real idea. So that's what's one of the
yeah,
things I think contributes so much to making it so fascinating is it was so much more of a there was so much more skin in the game for these people when they are going and literally sort of carving civilization in a lot of instances, kind of out of just really nothing, out of just the thin air. And nowadays, it makes sense the point you brought up about like, the fact that there are airplanes and stuff like that, and it's so cheap for people to travel. It makes sense why maybe we didn't see some immigration problems like maybe we see today in some areas because there was so much more friction for people to make these sort of jumps. But now we live in a world where it's so mobile, it's so easy for people to go from one place to another. I guess, were there any, reflections that you had in your travels in some of these places that made you think about, perhaps the current state of your own, continent, of Europe, of what, maybe reflections,
um,
parallels you saw maybe for the future?
well, the main realization that traveling through Latin America gave me, like, compared to, like, seeing their diversity in a sense and having experienced it living in the United States and living in Europe. In the United States, most of the immigrants are from the same part of the world Phil was from, and Argentina and Chile. And in Europe, most of the immigrants are it practice Islam, and they do have a bit of a different mentality that comes into play that I think makes the situation quite a bit different. But for the example of the United States, I think Brazil really shows how, in a sense, functional these diverse nations still can be. Like you have all these, for example, at these big gas stations on their major roads, and you have like these little gates, and you have to take out like one of these paper, like these plastic slots with like a QR code on them, and then you can go through the little gate.
I love it.
And then there's people guarding the gates, and then you take your food and you check out with like this plastic card, basically like a big chunky plastic card
Yeah.
with a QR code on it. And then before you can exit, you have to pay at this machine or you can pay at the desk. And then you can put your thing back in the machine and it opens the gate and you can pass through to get out. And there's guards again at that gate. And these are kind of solutions that a low trust society finds to still like facilitate economic transactions, facilitate business, do this kind of stuff. Like Japan and Korea and Switzerland, for example, and in a lot of like homogenous nations like the countryside generally, are examples of like very high trust societies or communities. And I haven't been to these countries yet. That's why I want to visit on my next trip. In Japan and Korea, there are stores where you just have like these freezers along the walls, and they're just like, "Hey, put some money on the desk, like in this little box, and just pay for whatever you took out." But there's some cameras, but there's no one there. There's not like some system with like Indians in some call center looking at how you're shopping, like Amazon Go. Have you heard of that?
Yeah.
It's just like based on trust. And there's some cameras. If someone like keeps stealing stuff, they could probably contact the police. But still, you don't have this. So they come up with different measures, and that these things kind of show that a low trust society can still be a relatively functioning society, even though you have problems with crime, you have problems with lack of trust, theft, all these kinds of things. But in the United States, if the immigration is gradual enough and they are able to appease the people and say like, oh yeah, we'll deport the illegal ones and then make a bunch of them legal so they can stay. And maybe if they keep having larger families and if the immigration continues, the United States will turn into a country similar to Latin America.
Yeah.
But in Europe, a lot of the immigrants are Muslim, and they tend to want to. It depends on the person, but there are a lot of followers of Islam that want to push Islam on people that are not Muslim, and they want to push their religious practices. They want to push their practices to like wear for women to wear a hijab and to eat not eat certain foods and all kinds of things. And that complicates the situation a little bit more than than it would in the United States, and it also causes a lot more conflict and friction between the natives and the immigrants. And when I lived in the United States, there are jokes about this group and there are jokes about that group, and there are jokes about people that are maybe just a little bit nerdy, even though they're the same group as you, or people that are into whatever, like anime or like something, whatever weird thing people
Yeah.
are into these days. But these people of Latin descent, Spanish speakers, Latinos in the United States integrate a lot more and are accepted a lot more, maybe than a lot of the immigrants in Europe. And there's some overlap, but I think it's still quite a different situation. And if things are gradual enough, and if there's no big backlash, I
It,
think
it's
the
fascinating.
United States will just kind of descend into what Brazil is today in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
But it will still exist as a country. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, it could still exist. It's because of their women. It's because, everyone loves Latinas in the United States, and so they're able to
Everyone loves
create a lot
Latinos.
more. Whereas, like, you have the Muslim population, they have to be a bit more covered up, and they have much more different customs. Whereas,
But there's in Europe, there's a little bit of the same as well, but it's not on the same level. I know what you mean. Like it's
yeah,
definitely not on the same level. And
no,
I know you're joking, of course. It's not serious what you're saying here.
yeah,
But the religion is a really big portion. That in the United States, people are less religious than in Latin America, but a lot of people coming over will be either atheist or they will be Catholic. And if
yeah,
they are Catholic, they won't conflict as much with American values
yeah.
as
Well,
Islam does.
it is
And it
honestly
causes a
not
lot less friction.
necessarily. Yeah, it is way different of a story because as much as like obviously we're seeing the tide sort of shift politically in the United States, like with the recent
Yes, it
election
does. It does.
like that, like
Yeah.
people are very much like the tide is kind of shifting in the direction of like people wanting tighter restrictions on immigration and everything like that. But I will say, like I obviously I've spent so much time in Latin America. Latinos are a much more resonant people to kind of Western civilization than perhaps, yeah, what you're seeing in Europe right now, where there's so much distinction. Like it's like kind of really like two alien cultures that are sort of
But you
sort of
also have to take into account, if a Latino goes to the United States, you don't know what race they actually are. Because Latino, like I said, is a cultural group basically. But they can be fully European and they can be fully of African descent and they can be fully of indigenous descent or even fully of Asian descent. Because I've seen some video. I've seen some videos a few times of people living in the United States, and they look Asian, and then they there was this guy, and he was like complaining about that people would ask him like, "Hey, where are you from?" He's like, "I'm from the United States," and then he's like, "No, no, where are your parents from?" And he's like, "Well, my parents are from Brazil," and then in my mind it goes like, "Oh, so his parents were descendant of Japanese that immigrated to Brazil, and then his parents immigrated to the United States." And that kind of stuff happens a lot. In the United States, I knew someone and his ancestors, if you go a few generations back, it started in Russia. They opposed the Reds. They were just they would call themselves the Whites, the people that were still in favor of the Tsar, like the royal family, and they had to flee Russia. So the family moves to Brazil, but they didn't do very well in Brazil, so they moved to the United States.
Yeah.
And now their descendants consider themselves Americans because if you have so many steps, then it's a little bit too complicated to give like one answer.
Yeah, I think the situation in the United States is a little bit different, and it's one of the things that we talked about even before hopping on here, that the word American means something quite a bit different than, for example, like in Europe, if someone says they're Dutch or German, that's really tied to an ethnicity, whereas in America, even people that are you know that are white, they don't really know. A lot of times, they don't know where their family came from. They think like
Or yeah.
white,
I noticed that as well.
they
And
they don't know.
In Latin America, they don't tend to know a little bit more actually from my experience. Like if
Yeah.
their family is like descended from Italians, I heard that a lot. Like, oh yeah, my grandma is Italian. A lot of people in Brazil are like trying to get Italian citizenship because it's a lot easier than a lot of the other European countries.
Yeah.
And yeah,
Yeah. So what that aside, one thing one thing I wanted to talk about, or one subject I wanted to talk about a little bit, was what has been what have been some of the more interesting reactions, I guess, to some of the content that you've been putting out there, or I guess like what have been some of the most, maybe like, have you gotten, because you seem like a very kind of like very friendly, very relatively non-political guy, but I imagine especially with
I always
your
try to be
videos.
open minded.
Yeah, especially like some of your videos getting as many, views as they are. I'm curious, like, have you gotten like hate comments, or what have been some of the most ridiculous reactions to some of the stuff that you've put out there?
Um, I I got some hate comments, but not any that I could like think of off the top of my head. But most of it was just like a lot of my competition were Brazilian. And like I said before, like the majority of them were very positive. But there were also some that were like, yeah, racist, this, Nazi, this, blah, blah, blah. But
Directed towards you, or just about the people? Like, were
they
they talking
tended to
about?
talk about like the people in the South in general.
Yeah,
And it wasn't really most of the time, it wasn't really about me. And I've shown different parts of the country in quite a diverse way. And yeah, that just shows like the internal friction that these nations still have, of course. But yeah, in person, when you meet people in person, you don't notice it as much because they have like their polite face on.
yeah,
And when you get to know them a little better, you can find out what really their values are and what their opinions are. And also something I came to understand in the last few years that I found very valuable is that people that have a different, yeah, like different political beliefs than you, they're not necessarily wrong. Sometimes you can have an argument where it is about like objective principles, like what is more efficient or what is, let's say, just what is more efficient. But a lot of the time, people that have different political beliefs than you also have different fundamental values. For example, left wing people that do value equity a lot more than merit, and right wing people tend to value merit a lot more than equity. And you can sometimes, if you have someone that's relatively intelligent and that's open to discussion and have a complete conversation. I've talked to many people, many different political beliefs. If they have very different political beliefs than you, that doesn't mean that they're always objectively wrong. There's a lot of like common misconceptions that will hear a lot over and over again. But I've met people that believe very different things, where if you have a civil conversation, you end up just ending that conversation at your fundamental values that differ. But other times, there are misunderstandings. Well, for example, like climate change is a really big one. Like, what things really affect climate change? How big of an effect does it have? If you have electric cars, solar power, there are certain benefits to these technologies. Like objectively, electricity can be a very cheap source of energy and less wasteful. But there are also other environmental problems that like the production of the batteries causes, the production of these solar panels cause, and often they can be recycled.
Yeah. So
So
so overall, like you haven't, just in general, you keep an open mind and you, for the most part,
I try to understand their point of view, and I don't think it's fair to put the same kind of like political lens on Latin America as on Europe or the United States, because there are some people in the South that want independence. Some people in the South of Brazil do want independence. There's a small independence movement. It's not very big or very likely to materialize into much, but some people don't want to be part of the country of Brazil and they want to have their own nation so they can better preserve their culture and restrict immigration, have their own policies. A lot of people in different regions of Brazil vote very differently. You can really clearly see that in the south, a lot of them vote more right wing, and in Brazil, a right wing isn't quite the same as it is in the United States. It's a little bit the norm of diversity and so on is a little bit different in Brazil. But people in the south vote more right wing, and people in the north vote more left wing.
so what does the future of your channel look like? What is some content that you're excited to record and put out there this year going forward?
So this year I want to go to Asia, and some examples. Some of the things I want to do there are I visited a lot of things in Brazil. I visited Japanese people in Brazil, but some of these Japanese people moved back to Japan. And there are certain parts of the country that a lot of them settle, like major manufacturing hubs of the country, where the Toyota factory, a lot of the big Toyota factories are located. They have a lot more Brazilians in that area and the surrounding area, which is kind of like the manufacturing belt of Japan. I want to visit there. And from what I heard, of course, I haven't visited yet, so my experience will change my view on it a little bit. But I heard that they have like little shops there where they advertise that they speak Portuguese. So I'm trying to learn like a little bit of Japanese, but I would be able to speak Portuguese with a shop owner and a shop like that visiting there, and that's what I will try to do there. And then there's other locations in Asia that have like these interesting regions and cultures and places that you wouldn't expect them that I kind of want to cover. And broad I also want to kind of branch out my content a little bit, but I don't want to like alienate my audience and doing stuff that goes too far away from the stuff that I tend to do. I also went skiing in the south of Brazil, for example. I went skiing in Chile and Argentina, and there are some videos coming up for that about that. And skiing is a sport that I really enjoy, and I hope to be able to do that more in the future, especially in countries that you wouldn't expect that you can even go skiing there.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's mainly my plans for the following year. But there are still a lot of videos coming out that I filmed in Latin America. I still have a lot to edit. So even though I already filmed those for from a viewer's perspective, there are still going to be a lot of videos coming out from Latin America and also from Chile and Argentina.
Yeah. Okay. Well, awesome, man. I look forward to watching, and I know anyone else interested in this will be as well too. So yeah, Lewis, thank you very much for joining me. Where can people find you and follow your stuff?
They can find me mainly on my YouTube channel. I'm also relatively active on my Instagram. I've only recently started to post like a few stupid reels on there. Like you also posted some recently.
Yeah, I
They
got.
were a little bit edgy, but I think some of them were pretty funny. Yeah. Yeah. But mainly my YouTube. I mainly focus on my YouTube content. I put a lot of work into that. Instagram is a little bit more like a secondary thing. But if you want to like contact me personally or ask any questions or anything like that, Instagram is better for that. But also, I read most of my YouTube comments and I try to respond to a lot of them, especially if they're in English, which makes it a little bit easier to respond.
Yeah.
But even in Portuguese and in German, I get a lot of comments in Portuguese and German, mostly Portuguese, and I respond to some of those as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, awesome, man. Thank you for joining me once again, and I look forward to watching some more of your colonial adventures. So thank you very
And you enjoy your mate.
yeah, I've been sitting on this, but all right, guys, that's it.